Well, welcome this morning. Archbishop Lazar and I are going to be discussing this morning a little bit about the nature of his theological, his ecclesial, his public life journey on this splendid blue canopy day at the Canadian Orthodox Monastery. I'd like to start initially with asking Archbishop Lazar a question about some of the differences between the St. Vladimir's Parisian tradition and some of the people he's been drawn from the wells he's dipped his thinking in, Archbishop Krepovitsky, Asco, Romanades. When I was growing up in the 1970s and feeling my way in the theological elements of the Orthodox tradition, I read a lot of Vladimir Lovsky and Schmemann and Meyendorf, Florovsky, and these tend to be more popular people in terms of who, when people are turning to Orthodoxy, they read today, whereas Archbishop Krepovitsky, Romanades, Ajkul, this whole tradition are not quite as well known. So perhaps, Archbishop Lazar, you could reflect a little bit on maybe the differences between these two traditions.
I wouldn't put George Florovsky as really a part of the Paris tradition because we had a conference in Bulgaria years ago on the clash between Bulgakov and Florovsky. Bulgakov was one of the founders of the Paris tradition. When the Paris School Saint-Serge was founded, it was founded mostly by people, partly at least, by people who had been part of the renovationist neo-Christians, and Bulgakov was one, the Solovyovian Brotherhood, and the focus on a blend of Gnosticism and Orthodoxy, what they call the Sophianist movement. Vladimir Solovyov was part of a tradition who went back to the ancient Gnostics and were interested in a theory of the divine Sophia. Sophia is almost a part of the Holy Trinity, but not quite. A sort of a fourth person of the Holy Trinity, not realizing that from an Orthodox point of view, Jesus Christ is the divine wisdom. You know, the church in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia means divine wisdom. So it was built for Jesus Christ, the divine wisdom, is the full name of the church. The wisdom, word, and power of God that creates and sustains all things. Solovyov was in that tradition in 19th century Russia. It was a very poor spiritual time in Russia. Some of our neo-Gnostics sort of praised 19th century Russia as being the great spiritual era. It was a spiritualist era, but it wasn't a spiritual era. And that formation then of Solovyov, followers of Jacob Bebe and Schelling and other German romantics, figured it very much into it. The Saint-Serge Academy had people like Karinsky. He was basically an atheist socialist, but he was one of the factors in the Saint-Serge Academy because they took it as a way to manifest their scholarly talents. And you had a number of people involved in it were sort of crypto-Protestants and followers of the YMCA, and this spiritualist Gnostic tradition to come out of it. Now, Bulgakov's is the most well-known of that school. And Bulgakov's writings are extremely attractive, and he had a lot of very good ideas about the reformation of the Orthodox Church. That is, reformation, not changing, but going back to the originals. So he had a lot of influence on subsequent people from that school. There was a clash between him and George Florovsky, which ended up in Florovsky leaving the Paris Academy. And I think I did a paper for the Bulgarian conference on the Bulgakov affair. The whole idea of the conference was the clash between Florovsky and Bulgakov. Well, Florovsky came to North America, and he and Romanides, Father John Romanides from the Greek Church, became actually best friends. and they were both interested in a patristic revival in theology in North America. And that ties them a little bit to Kropotkin, because Metropolitan Anthony Kropotkin and others, of course he wasn't singular, were struggling to bring Orthodox theology back to the Holy Fathers and away from Western scholasticism. So he was part of this idea for patristic revival, but he was also interested in bringing the liturgy back to something more sound. All the innovations in the ritual and rank and things, the people were excluded from the liturgy. Kropotkin was interested in bringing them back into the liturgy, making it the work of the people again. But that clash between this neo-Gnostic, neo-Christian movement at St. Serge Academy and the ones who wanted to restore patristic theology as opposed to the scholastic theology was part of the ferment after the Revolution. And fortunately, Florovsky came to North America first, and he had Romanides at the time was dean of the Greek seminary, and he was dean of St. Vladimir's, and they tried to engineer this patristic revival, and so they attracted the attention of a lot of people. In later years, I became acquainted with Romanides in the 1950s from an article he had done in the Greek Orthodox Theological Review, and had written to him. I think I was 17 or 18 at the time, and I had found this article especially interesting, and I wrote to him, and we had a bit of correspondence, and in a way he became sort of a mentor to me. I would say that Romanides was the first direct influence on the formation of my theology. In 1966, an acquaintance of mine her sister-in-law had translated Metropolitan Anthony some of his works on Dostoevsky, and she introduced me, I think it was 1966, she introduced me to Kropotkin's writings on Dostoevsky, and it resonated with me immediately, because he saw the power of Dostoevsky's writings. Dostoevsky was a great existentialist, and he saw the power of his writings in projecting that co-suffering love is the only power or force or strength that anybody could ever have for the healing of another human soul.
So would you see in your whole theology of co-suffering love, it's drawn a lot from Fyodor Dostoevsky?
Well, drawn more from Metropolitan Anthony Kropotkin. And I discussed Kropotkin with Romanides. Romanides wasn't too fond of Kropotkin for various reasons, although both of them wrote very much in the same vein. But Kropotkin was the first time I found out there was no such thing as original sin, for example. You know, people were teaching that in the Orthodox Church because it was that scholastic school that had come into Russia in the 1700s, and then the influence of the Roman Catholics through the Unia, through the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. We had a lot of Roman Catholic ideas in theology, and one of them was the doctrine of original sin. Metropolitan Anthony sort of refuted that, and later Romanides' doctoral thesis was against the doctrine of original sin and the substitutionary sacrifice theory of salvation.
And this is where his critique of Augustan would come
from.
Yes.
Well, his critique of Augustan, you know, I know people are going to defend Augustan bitterly, but they're not going to read him. They're going to just defend him. Augustan is the creator of almost all Western heresies, almost all of them. He double predestination, he came up with original sin, which is heresy. He was the foundation of Anselm's substitutionary sacrifice theory, and he invented limbo for unbaptized children. and in a way helped to give the idea of purgatory. But nevertheless, people would defend Augustine because he was a hyper-moralist, and they're hyper-moralist. But Augustine is the root cause of the final split between East and West. And that's just a fact. However, people want to defend him.
So why would you say Anthony Krepovitsky and John Romanides are not as well known in the West as, say, the St. Vladimir's people, Alexander Schmemann and John Meyendorff and people?
Well, I'm very fond of Schmemann. I don't have much use for Meyendorff's writings, but Schmemann was exceptional, I think. And Schmemann was, whatever his formation was, he came to be more in the mold of George Pawlowski. And he contributed quite a lot. But the reason they're well known is because, first of all, Romanides and Krepovitsky are in the past, too far in the past. And they became, the people who came from the Paris Academy to St. Vladimir's had more publicity, let's say, and caught on more. And very few people have actually studied Metropolitan Anthony's works. And very few people that I've encountered today have even read Romanides. Romanides on the ancestral sin, his actual doctoral thesis, is to me one of the most profoundly important works of Orthodox theology. And if anybody who's trying to convert to Orthodoxy or take an Orthodox formation, it's one of the first things they should read after they read Callisto Swear. They should read Romanides. And then you can go a step further and read Krepovitsky.
You've done probably one of the major sort of theological, intellectual biographies of Anthony Krepovitsky, haven't you? This work here.
And we translated his moral idea of the main dogmas of the Church in proper context, which was done partly as a refutation of Immanuel Kant's ideas that the dogmas of the Church are a hindrance to morality. Metropolitan Anthony Krepovitsky responded by writing the moral idea of the main dogmas. It wasn't an exposition of the dogmas, it was the moral idea against Kant's argument that the dogmas were a hindrance to morality.
Comment a little bit upon your interest over the last few decades in science. There has been this tension often between theology and science, and you've tried to navigate a pathway in which one can respect the best insights of science and bringing together theology. And where did this concern come from?
Well, I'm not sure. I studied science assiduously. I studied science at University of BC, and the fact is, when science is talking about matters, it's examining them very carefully, looking into them very deeply, and we build on facts in science. So some of the idea that you can refute facts with alternate facts is sort of Trumpian nowadays, but there are a lot of theologians or church writers, especially evangelical fundamentalists, who oppose science to religion, and they do so because they refuse to believe facts even when they're clearly demonstrated. And for me, truth and reality are not in opposition to one another, but reality and truth complement one another. So you can't have truth without reality. And people are trying to put forth what they call truth from mythologies and fantasies. And that isn't faith, that's ideology. And so much of modern Christianity is not based on faith, it's based on ideology. And it's ideology that people hold to almost in a cult-like fashion. All fundamentalism is ideology. So when you look at the book of Genesis, you have to see a deep moral meaning in it and a deep revelation, but you cannot see facts. It's not a historical book. the book of Genesis, already in the late 50s, I realized that the book of Genesis was probably written around the year 550. I mean, there were people saying that, of course, because when it says that Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, there were no Chaldees at the time of Abraham. Abraham came from the Sumerians. The Chaldees were, at that time, probably not even an organized tribe, but they were a West Semitic tribe who spoke a West Semitic dialect. And they came into the delta of Tigris and Euphrates at about 900. And they gained power in Sumeria in about 600 BC. So it's impossible that Abraham could have come from Ur of the Chaldees. And that atavism tells you that the book of Prophetic. See, modern Judaism, or the Judaism we know, was born in Babylon. It wasn't, the Israelites were not monotheist. The imperial cult of Yahweh was monotheist. The imperial, I say imperial because Israel, David was never king of Israel. He was king of Judea, and Israel was part of his empire. But Israel remained, and so did most of Judea. The ordinary people remained pagan. We know from archaeological find that until the return from Babylon, people still kept house gods, tribal gods, local gods, and hilltop shrines. After the return from Babylon, this abruptly ended. So we look at it and say, well, okay, what we know from science is, of course, here, about 3 plus billion years old, that man evolved from eukaryote, single-celled eukaryotes. And all of these facts, these are facts. Now, religious people, religious fundamentalists are opposed to facts, and they're opposed to reality. They're tuned only to ideology, like the present ideology that you have to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It's just an ideology, it's not an aspect of faith. And so there tends to be this clash, and you realize, well, these Christians, including many Orthodox, including Prophetic, who never accepted evolution or Darwin, they were telling us that you had to choose between God and truth, between God and reality. And that's the thing that interested me in the study of science and religion, that you don't need to choose between God and truth, because God is truth. But science also is truth, and science is uncovering truth. So the book of Genesis took on a radically different meaning for me. And I was searching for the meaning in it, and realizing that the whole story of the fall is the story of man's fall into egotism, self-love, and self-interest. That's why Cain killed Abel, because his ego was offended. And when Satan tempted, or the serpent, it doesn't say Satan didn't exist yet when that book was written. It was something I developed later, drawn probably out of Zoroastrianism, which of course influenced the formation of Judaism, because it was part of a system in Babylon at the time. When Satan tempted, or the serpent tempted Eve and subsequently Adam, he tempted them with ego. You can become like God if you accept the counterfeit for what God, that I'm offering you, for what God has already given you. See, they were the type and likeness of image and likeness of God. And Satan said, well, you can become like God. Adam and Eve could have responded, but we're already like God. We're his likeness and image. Now you're telling me we can become like God. That's a falsehood. Well, they didn't. They fell for it, and that was the birth of ego. See, I mean, one could say that Satan's ego and trying to be equal to God in heaven was the first example of ego, taking over the soul and taking over the mind. But in the Garden of Eden story, ego takes over the human mind and the human heart and the human conversation.
So this is a very different read of Genesis than what you would get for those who become preoccupied with the literal day and hence a young earth theory, and then they collide between religion and theology. And so this approach, in terms of a different exegetical or allegorical read of the text, is much more life-giving and speaks much more to the human condition of self-understanding and transformation. And in that sense, it's a much more mature and healthier view of how one interprets. I was going to ask you another question. You've had over the years tensions with Seraphim Rose on the toll house. You want to explain some of what those issues are and the collision and?
Well, the toll house myth was unheard of and never taught in any seminaries and never appeared in any catechism. Justin Popovich makes that clear. Justin Popovich never included the toll house teaching in his book on his theological book. One of his disciples added it in after his death, and but he himself was asked once about the toll house story because people had heard it from folk religion, and he said, "Well, it's not a matter of theology. It's a matter of sort of folk religion, but not a matter for theology." Why I got involved in it, Seraphim Rose put it wasn't our first clash, by the way. Seraphim Rose started in his journal a series about trying to make the toll house teaching known to people and trying to advocate for it. Now, at the time, at Williamsville, New York, there was a parish I was quite close to, and a boy about 14 years old, well, he was 14, very pious kid, loves to serve in the altar, he was killed in an automobile accident. And somebody gave his mother that series Seraphim Rose had done on the toll houses because the boy had just been killed. Now, she almost had a nervous breakdown and left the church over it because what if she accepted the toll house teaching, she had to accept that her beautiful, pious son was now going to be tortured by demons for infinitely long before he could even approach Christ. My first concern about the toll house heresy, I call it heresy because it is a Gnostic heresy. I know a lot of ancient church writers mentioned it in one way or another. Some of them accepted it. It was nevertheless, of course, literally borrowed directly from the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a pagan thing. And my first concern was pastoral. How does such a hideous teaching affect people pastorally? So I responded to this woman's quandary pastorally. And that's why I started to refute the teaching. But at that time, the Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Boston was a theological powerhouse. It was still in its heyday. And they had people there who could read and translate from Aramaic and Hebrew and even Old Church Slavonic as well as Russian, and of course Greek. So they encouraged me, and I needed some patristic material, and they went out of their way to find patristic material for me and translate it. And then whatever I wrote was sent to Anusis, to the monastery, the women's monastery, the Holy Archangels, who proofed it and double-checked it with the fathers. And I asked Romanides about the toll house teaching, and he said, and his words were in inimitable Romanides' way, "What a load of crap that is." So I examined it, and we got into it. And I could see that it was also a heresy against the patristic doctrine of anthropology. The soul absolutely cannot be judged without the body. And the soul can't function in any psychophysical way without the body. That is absolutely the teaching of the Holy Fathers. Whatever folk religion or mythology anyone wants to put into it, that is what the Holy Fathers taught. So then I realized that it wasn't only a pastoral matter, it was a theological matter. And that none of the great fathers of the church ever mentioned the toll houses, ever even hint at or indicate them. Not Ephraim the Syrian, Isaac the Syrian, or St. Basil the Great, or St. John Chrysostom. It's all these peripheral people. And some of them very great people, but peripheral. And it doesn't figure into any liturgical text. It's not present in the memorial services for the departed, and there's not even a hint of it in the funeral service. So if it was an actual teaching of the church, it would appear in all these things. Then somebody gave me a translation of St. Mark of Ephesus at the Council of Florence refuting purgatory. I hadn't realized until then that the Orthodox Church had no doctrine or dogma about the afterlife. There was no doctrine in the church about what happens after you die. It was left alone. St. John of the Ladder, other holy fathers say that it's only conceit that would lead a person to speculate about it in the first place. St. Mark of Ephesus gave us the Orthodox doctrine of what happens after death, because he had to, he was forced to, by the Roman Catholic, by the cardinals in the Roman Catholic Church. And his doctrine of the afterlife was then what became the doctrine of the church. And it has absolutely no reference to any toll houses or anything like it. And in fact, St. Mark of Ephesus says the righteous, the believers have passed from life into death already, as Christ says. So they don't really rise up in judgment. Their conscience is your only judge, not the demon. So I realized how anti-patristic, anti-scriptural, and anti-pastoral this teaching of the toll houses was. So it became a little bit of passion for me. Now, I'm not surprised that the people are still defending it. In my view, it's a kind of a fundamentalist, almost cult-like defense of it, because it certainly can't be defended theologically. You can list all kinds of people who wrote about it or believed it in the ancient church, all the way back to the Egyptians, of course, because it is an Egyptian mythology. And you can say that's proof. That isn't proof. The proof is in the theology of it. And you cannot defend it from the theology of the church. You simply can't defend it. And it does a lot of pastoral damage.
So it was your...
And it was a pastoral concern that was my first concern that got me involved.
So just as it was a pastoral concern that got you involved in the toll house, so it was a pastoral concern that has brought you into the LGBTQ issue. Is that this also is...
Well, it's always pastoral because, I'm very Kropotkin in that way. My pastoral concerns. Metropolitan Anthony opened seminary classes to women in the early 1900s when that was unthinkable. And, I passed on to Metropolitan Vladimir later, who became Metropolitan of Kiev after Anthony was in the diaspora. Anthony Kropotkin also opened a seminary classes for readers and really overhauled the seminary system to make it less rigid and scholastic out of pastoral concern. He treated the students like younger brothers instead of like subservient beings calling around. So it was pastoral concern for it. And what struck me about the LGBT questions is I encountered a couple of transgendered people. Now, instead of spouting off some ideological pejorative about them, I went to the UBC gender clinic and the Vancouver Hospital Gender Clinic and did some research and asked questions and did quite a bit of reading. And I followed the science and came to the conclusion that neither transgendered people nor gay people make any conscious choice. They're born that way. And people will inevitably, fundamentalists will say, oh, well, God engineers all the fetuses. He would never allow that to take place in the fetus. Well, when you're saying that, you're also saying that God engineers retinoblastoma, Down syndrome, cystic fibrosis, and all these other things that children are born with. Either he engineers the fetus or he doesn't. And if he does engineer that closely, then God is responsible for all these horrible childhood diseases or diseases that children are born with, all these genetic diseases. Well, that's untenable. I couldn't accept that. that God purposely makes people cystic fibrosis or gives them retinoblastoma. So I also couldn't accept the fact that God would purposely engineer out transgender or, well, gay. I was more interested in the transgender people, but because they suffered the most persecution, as I could see it. And so I looked at the science, and the science told me something different. And the science it became more solid, more sound as time went by because there were more and more. And then I thought, well, if you ask a million gay people if they chose to be gay and they say no, there's a pretty good chance that no is the proper answer because they know. And I realized that people have said that, they had these, what do they call it, these movements like Exodus and all. They were going to pray the gay away, which was made up it was gay people who had an evangelical ideology who founded these things. And then after a long term, people like Exodus and all realized that they were fraudulent. You can't change gay people to not being gay. You can get gay people to get married and have children. You can have gay people who are total virgins all their lives, or even go to monasteries sometimes. But they're still gay. They're still homosexual. They don't suddenly start not being attracted to men and being attracted to women. You get any number of people who, for various reasons, will get married and have children. I have two instances. One was a Southern Baptist minister who was very virulently anti-gay, homophobic, as they say, and against transgendered people. He'd been married for 24 years, and then he came out to his wife, got divorced, and married his boyfriend. He'd had a boyfriend all these years. All the time he was preaching against homosexuality, he was going on little holidays with his boyfriend. Well, she had quite a collapse over that. And another woman, well, two or three I came across finally, that had been married for as many as 20, 30 years, and suddenly the man comes out of the closet. He's been, of course, having sexual relations with other men, but married and had children. But he couldn't change this. So I was wondering, one time we had a deacon, it was a friend, acquaintance, not a friend, an acquaintance of mine, and he tried to commit suicide. So I went to the hospital to see him. Why did he try to commit suicide? Well, he'd gotten married and couldn't fulfill his conjugal obligations to his wife because he was homosexual. We asked him, well, if you're homosexual, why did you get married? That's fraudulent. And he said, well, I confessed to the bishop, when I was deacon candidate, I confessed to the bishop that I was homosexual. And he told me as soon as you get married, it'll go away. It'll change. See? Well, he got married on the bishop's advice. It didn't go away. It didn't change. And his wife was about to have a breakdown thinking that something was wrong with her. And then he finally came out of the closet. But he felt like suicide was the only answer. It was the suicides of these people that gained my pastoral interest. So many young people committing suicide. And in the church, after what, and I know some priests will deny it, but I have known people to go commit suicide directly from confession to suicide because of what the clergy told them about themselves. To say that homosexuality is a matter of choice is simply a lie. The science is against it. And so, anyway, it caught my pastoral attention for transgender people.
So again,
it's sort of peripheral. The gay people are sort of peripheral. It was the transgendered people that. So I met a number of transgendered people. I have transgendered people who come to the church here sometimes, and well, we have to gradually, as society is coming to realize this, because science is too compelling for the ideology to survive. And we are transforming, we're changing. So the whole society is changing. And of course, the reaction sets in among the ultra-conservatives and fundamentalists. Reaction was more or less what caused the Russian Revolution. I mean, we have all kind of mythologies about that, but the imperial government bears the primary responsibility for the revolution taking place in Russia, for the Bolsheviks, and the policies of the imperial government and the reactionaryism. So I then came to the realization that moral outrage is a form of confession. Most of the virulently homophobic people are deeply suppressed, deeply repressed gay people themselves. And many of them are clergy in the church, in every church, every one of the Christian churches, on his own as well. So moral outrage is a form of confession because we hate most in others what we fear most in ourselves.
And one final question. There has been a tendency of the Orthodox in North America to lean towards republicanism,
Yeah.
and also in the contemporary sense being a supporter of Trump. And this gives them affinity, interesting enough, with the conservative evangelicals.
Oh.
How would you respond to that Orthodox tendency to lean towards the right historically, and at the present time to uncritically, many of them sort of genuflect to Trump and that whole Trumpism? Because you've stood against that for many
Yeah.
decades, and
Oh,
one
yeah,
of the
sure.
few Orthodox
Of course, I'm a red Tory.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in terms of your political theology, it certainly isn't on the right in that sense. And you faced a lot of opposition for not linking republicanism with
Yeah.
Orthodoxy.
Well, of course, being a monarchist, I'm opposed to republicanism because republicanism simply means no monarch. But I remember that, the reason the Republican colors are red and the Democratic colors are blue is because the Republican Party was originally a liberal party up until, I think, Teddy Roosevelt, and then Taft, who was his successor, was less progressive. But we forget that Teddy Roosevelt, great Republican president, was the one who introduced regulation in the food and drug industry, the one who created the national park system, and the one who was really interested in improving the healthcare system in America. And it's too bad he didn't run for another term. He could have, because he was serving out the previous president's term. And one term of his own, he could have been elected for another term. Instead, he turned it over to Taft. And Taft was, Taft was an interesting person, but he was a little bit less progressive and more in the pocket of the emerging industry. And from Taft on, the Republican Party began gradually to become ultra right wing. Now, the reason for that is ultimately, if you look at today's so-called conservative Republicans, they're actually 19th century liberals. So what they're trying to conserve is 19th century liberalism with laissez-faire, deregulation and all.
Why did the Orthodox not see through that, though? What's going on there?
After the revolution, the conservatives, I'd say the reactionary element in the Orthodox Church, began to become dominant because of the revolution. Even Metropolitan Anthony, after the 1905 revolution, became more and more reactionary. I won't say conservative because I consider myself a genuine conservative, part of the High Troy tradition. And I consider modern conservatives just to be neoliberals. They're 19th century liberals who've been microwaved. And that's about it. Well, people are so ignorant of history, they can't really see that. But what disturbed me in the time of Richard Nixon was Orthodox hierarchs and priests saying, "Oh, you have a moral obligation to vote for Richard Nixon." I thought, are you kidding me? A moral obligation. You have an immoral obligation to support Richard Nixon because we knew the history of Richard Nixon from the McCarthy years. We knew that he was a liar and a cheat, and that he would destroy human lives for his own political gain. We knew all that. So we knew what kind of man Richard Nixon was. There was a famous incident when Harry Truman was still president. He was asked something about Richard Nixon, and he said, "I wouldn't trust that shifty-eyed SOB under any circumstances." It was a big scandal, I said. Well, you called him a son of a bitch. Truman replied in typical fashion, no, I just meant silly old boy, and defused the whole thing. That Richard Nixon was a crook from the beginning, and people who had a sense of history knew that. But Republican spelled right-wing, and right-wing to these people spelled morality. But the right-wing has been far more immoral than the left-wing, and far more predatory, and far less Christian in any respect. But because of ideologies, not faith, not religion, not morality or anything, because of ideology, people supported Richard Nixon. And of course, in the end, they got the comeuppance. But I still find reactionaries who defend Richard Nixon. Well, you'll find the same with Donald Trump. He's probably the most immoral president, the most illiterate president, and the most predatory president that the United States has ever had. Typical Republican in short. Predatory, dishonest, and ignorant. To me, that describes republicanism in the United States. And what's happened now, you supported this grossly immoral man. Do you think moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, you think that was an ideological move on his part? No, not nonsense. He doesn't have that depth of character. He moved the embassy because his base, this wild-eyed fundamentalist group in the evangelical church, were demanding it, and he wanted to secure his base before the midterm election. So this was just being a political predator. He didn't care how much violence, how much death, how much discord he caused in the Middle East by doing this. And this mythology of Israel that the fundamentalists and evangelicals spread, and many Orthodox buy into it, is really very destructive and a poor reading of Scripture, and abandoning the Orthodox Christian doctrine that Christianity is the new Israel. We are the children of Abraham. So that's the doctrine of the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox people who participate in Trumpism have completely abandoned that, completely abandoned all sense of morality, and want to make up. I mean, there's plenty wrong with Mrs. Clinton, but not nearly so much as the Republican and right-wing propaganda made out to be. She at least knew how government works in this. So, yes, I have opposed this abandonment of morality and in favor of mythological ideologies, because it is ideology that's driving this whole thing. But a lot of Orthodox clergy are converts from evangelicalism, fundamentalism, and they brought all that baggage with them. We have some bishops now who supported the Golden Dawn movement in Greece, and I can't name them because they'd go out of their way to punish me if they did. I mean, they already have, in part. But, I suffered a great deal for my pastoral stance, and for the theology, too. If I pointed out some of the archbishops who compromised themselves with Trumpism, compromised their morality and their theology, they would take steps to punish me further. So you can't really do that in the church, because the church is primarily a political organization, secondarily a spiritual organization, as much as we struggle to the contrary to try to make it different. So you have to be politically cautious in the Orthodox Church in order to survive. So, especially if you're a hirer. So this is not just a moral concern, a pastoral concern. That, Donald Trump, they say, well, he's opposed to abortion. No, he isn't. He's not opposed to anything. He's just in favor of Trump and of whatever benefits Trump. I mean, he's been involved in such shady deals that we know that are not fake news, as the Trumpians like to say. Why is it that everything that opposes or exposes Trump is fake news? Of course, any sane person knows that can't be true. But the followers of Trump aren't necessarily sane. That's a part of it. And they aren't moral and they aren't Christians. No matter what they call themselves, they've abandoned Christianity in favor of ideology. And that's the crux now. And I mean, I know that's strong to say that, but I don't believe that a lot of the followers of Trump are even believers. But they have an ideology. And Mr. Trump's going to play that ideology to the hilt to keep his base.
Well, maybe we should bring this to a close. We've had the choir of the birds behind us. We've had the train earlier on, but we're very fortunate in the last almost hour to listen to Archbishop Lazar, who in many ways is probably one of the most prolific Orthodox theologians in North America, as well as in many ways the conscience of the Orthodox Church in some ways, and in his own way very much a prophet to the Orthodox Church and beyond. So thank you so much, not only for your thinking, your life, and much else. I know it has inspired many people, giving many others hope, and will continue to do so. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.